The issue of immigration has been a hot topic in Canada, not only in political circles, but also when it comes to the economy, housing, and the labor market. The government admits it has made mistakes and vows to fix the problem, but what are the broader implications? TD Economics has come out with a report called Popping Canada's Population Bubble, and one of the authors of that report is James Orlando. He's director and senior economist at TD. He joins me here in studio. It's nice to have you here.
No, thank you.
Let's start with maybe how we got here in terms of the immigration challenges as you see them, then we can talk about a bit what the government is planning to do.
Yeah, so after the pandemic was, we were going to reopening and everything, the government opened the doors. They opened the floodgates really for population growth. They did it through a few channels. They did it through lack of oversight in the educational system with respect to colleges, universities having too many international students coming in. But they also did it through allowing firms to hire low-wage workers for jobs where they couldn't find Canadians to take those jobs. Right. And so as a result, our population ballooned. You know, we had over 1.2 million people come to the country last year. That is well outpacing what we've seen in the past. It's well outpacing the infrastructure. It's well outpacing really everything. So whether it be housing, whether it be doctors, sewers, infrastructure, but all of it, everything. We had population growth. You know, I've done the analogy of musical chairs. You know, we had a number of chairs that Canadians didn't want to sit in the jobs, and we had a bunch of people coming in. But the problem is we didn't have enough chairs for the rest of society. We didn't have enough doctors, we didn't have enough roads, we didn't have enough everything else around. We didn't have enough balance really for the Canadian economy. And so now the government's doing a U-turn by changing their immigration and their non-permanent resident strategy.
And in concert, I will just say, whether intentionally or not, with what's happening in the States, which I'll talk to you about at the end, because that obviously has implications. You highlight some of what the policy changes the government has said they're going to be implementing. So maybe we can take a look at some of these charts. Yeah. You can tell us maybe what the changes are, what they're declaring, and then tell us what the implications are. So let's start with what they're saying.
Sure. So the first graph we're showing right now is the immigration path, right? So when you look at this, what we're trying to show is these are the people that come through the typical point system immigration channel, right? Yeah. This is, you know, Canada's pride and joy in the sense that we've had, you know, one of the world-renowned immigration systems. We picked the best and brightest from around the world. And, you know, we had been having steady growth. And this really wasn't the problem for the government in the sense that this was stable. You know, the forecast was coming in, the number of people coming in was meeting the forecast. But to really hammer home the point that we need to have an adjustment period, the government is having a slowing of growth of the number of people coming in. So we're looking at, we're initially going to have about 500,000 people come in next year, and it's going to be a little bit less than 400,000 this year. So we're not cutting immigration. Yeah. That's not what's happening. Yeah. We're just reducing the amount of immigration coming through in the typical channels.
Right.
But the next thing is, and this is really
the source, right?
Yeah, this is the source of problem because we were meeting the targets when it came to immigration. We weren't meeting the targets, and what was getting out of control with population was what's going on with non-permanent residents. And you can see here the green, which is the green line, the green bars here. That was surging, you know, in the last couple of years. Yeah. And what the government wants to do is they actually want to have an exodus of about 1 million people. So 1 million non-permanent residents will leave Canada over the next 2 years.
Is there, and we were discussing, is there a natural attrition that happens? Is this, I mean, have the government detailed the how? Is this, like, how is that going to?
There is a natural attrition in the sense that not everyone that comes to Canada through a non-permanent resident channel intends to stay. Yeah. You know, there's, when we look back at history, you know, about 30 to 40% people might potentially stay that come, right? So a lot of people will leave, and I think the government's banking on that happening. The question is, did the people that came in the last couple of years, did they have the intention of coming to Canada as a source to citizenship, or did they come here for a job or for school and intend to leave afterwards? Right. Because the government's banking on this change to happen to provide that sort of balance. And the next chart we're showing is what is the population path for Canada. So we obviously...
You have here stall speed, and so I just want to just tell us what you mean by stall speed.
So when you think about the government's trying to have immigration target of about 400,000 people in the next couple of years, but they're going to have over the next 2 years 1 million people leave, we're effectively having zero population growth. The population is intended to be zero over the next couple of years. Now, this doesn't change the fact that we rose well above our trend.
Yeah.
You know, when we think about planning in society, we think about, for example, housing as the most obvious way of thinking about this, where we think the population is going to grow by this amount of people over the next few years, and so we're going to build this many houses because that's the demand we think we're going to have. Now, if population well exceeds that, we're going to have a gap. We're going to have demand outpacing supply. And the thing with this chart is that we still have that gap in place.
Yeah,
it's just not as bad.
You still see that red line where you're just, yeah, we're well above trend.
Yeah, it's just not as bad as what it was before.
Yeah.
And this is hope. The hope is that this will provide a little bit more balance in society.
So let's go through the good and the bad in this. So what are the good? What is the good outcome from this?
Well, I think the good outcome is that I think the biggest concern on a lot of Canadians' minds is housing affordability, quality of life. And when we think about quality of life, we use this measure called GDP per capita, so GDP per person. And we've been on the decline for years now. And that is horrific because it means that Canadian living standards don't keep up. It means that Canadian wages don't keep up. It means that we just don't have the growth in society. But housing specifically, we've been having an undersupply of housing relative to demand, as we're showing here. Now, the hope is that with all of this incentive to build right now, you know, the government's put in so many programs to try to get housing, you know, shovels in the ground, let's get people homes. Now, the hope is that you slow population growth enough, you're able to have some catch up to make affordability just a little bit better for Canadians. So the quality of life for Canadians isn't as stretched as it was.
What's the bad?
So the bad news is that when you have these surges in population, that means that we had a big bump in the number of consumers that came to Canada, right? Because every new Canadian is also a consumer. They spend money. They might spend more or less than a Canadian that's already here. But that means that if we're having a million people leave and we're having population growth go to zero, Economics 101 says your economic growth is predicated on how much labor force growth you have and how much productivity you had. We've had no productivity, and now we're looking at no labor force growth.
So we hope productivity kicks in at some point.
Hope productivity kicks in, but we also hope that Canadians that have been pulling back their spending, heavily indebted Canadians, I might add, have been pulling back their spending because of high interest rates.
Right.
Now, the hope is that as interest rates go down, those Canadians that have been on the sidelines when it comes to spending money are going to start spending money again. And we're actually starting to see early signs of that happening right now. We're starting to see the real estate market starting to bounce back again.
Yeah.
We're starting to see spending activity bounce back again. And so as a result, the hope is that we, as Canadians, will step in for the fact that we're going to have a time period of zero population growth.
What is the risk of, I guess this is kind of like the bad question, just kind of blown up a little bit, what's the risk if the government doesn't get these changes right or they're not implemented in the right way? What can happen?
Well, I think it's kind of more of the same in the sense that when we are hoping that population growth will stall, we're hoping that balance will be restored to some extent. Now, if we don't have population growth actually, flatlining, we don't have that opportunity for rebalancing, then that means this inflation in housing, the lack of affordability, the strain on public services, all of that would just be magnified and extended for another 2 years. Yeah. And I think that's just what Canadians don't want. Like, immigration used to be something in Canada that was extremely favorable amongst Canadians. This is an immigration society. And then you look at polling right now and it's become a hot button issue.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that it's pointing to the fact that we had a policy that didn't make sense, and they're trying to reverse that such that balance is restored and Canadians can be happy again, a little bit more happy than what they've been.
We've just had some inflation data that came out, maybe a little, as I said, spicier than we were expecting. So what's your take on what the Canadian inflation picture is right now?
Yeah, it moved higher. It moved from 1.6% to 2% in inflation. Now, a lot of people are saying, oh, is this the start of, even higher inflation? Because I think we have a little bit of, some bad memories of higher inflation previously. And it's been a while since we had inflation start to rise. I would argue that inflation is still around the Bank of Canada's 2% target. It's going to be having days where it's going to be higher, lower. We don't see anything that's going to make it significantly move higher, that's going to derail the Bank of Canada from its current easing cycle right now, which is good. Obviously, something we worry about, but it's something we watch. watch. But right now, the higher inflation that we saw is not something that should change the Bank of Canada's plans at all.
Does it change the magnitude of their plans, though? I mean, what rate cut are you expecting to have in December?
Yeah, we think the Bank of Canada should cut by 25 basis points. They cut by 50 basis points in their prior meeting. We thought that probably wasn't necessary. We think it might have been a little bit of an overreaction to some of the economic data. I think when they saw inflation going to 1.6%, they're like, okay, let's start cutting faster. And we said, we don't think that's really necessary. This is going to be some ups and downs, as I just said. But given everything that's going on right now, you still have interest rates probably too high for what the Canadian economy needs right now. Yeah. Canadians are, we are a heavily indebted society. We have a high unemployment rate. We've had consumers being hesitant with high interest rates. The Bank of Canada needs to cut interest rates. They need to keep doing it, but they can do it at a slower path. They don't need to do it all in one go. So 25 basis point makes much more sense than to keep going aggressively, especially when you look at how the real estate market's starting to react right now. We're starting to see a huge pickup in demand there. And if the Bank of Canada keeps doing outsized cuts, that's just going to make Canadians feel that fear of missing out, that FOMO, and we don't want to have that market explode again like it did in prior years.
What about the flip side, though? I mean, with everything happening in the U.S., and I mean, there's so many cross currents going on. It's going to be hard to tell, but I think people think today that it nets out to be inflationary, more tariffs, deportation, all the things that check these inflationary. So if that happens, what does that mean for Canada?
Well, so think about if that happens and higher inflation comes through in the U.S., which is what's expected. What investors are pricing right now is the Federal Reserve is going to cut rates slower. They're not going to go as fast. They might have to stop earlier. They're going to start pausing, see how the economy is going. Whereas in Canada, we have a situation where economic growth, inflation, it's kind of been as expected, right? We haven't had that thing to derail us just yet. But what that means is if the Fed stops cutting earlier and the Bank of Canada keeps cutting, our rate's going to be a lot lower in Canada. Yeah. And what that means for example, anyone looking to travel to the United States anytime soon is that that's going to put even more pressure on the loonie, which is already flirting with lows right now. And it just keeps because what happens is the spread between that policy rate in Canada versus the US is just going to get wider and wider.
Yeah. And so tell me how does that manifest itself as the sub 70-cent loonie?
It could. I think there's risks that it could go that low. I think right now what would cause that to happen is probably more rhetoric directed at Canada. Yeah. I think most of the rhetoric you're hearing south of the border is directed towards, China, directed towards Europe, even Mexico. Yeah. Canada has been really kind of out of the news so far. But, if Trump follows through with the 10% blanket tariffs on everyone, let's say that happens, you're looking at a big hit to Canadian exports. We're a really dependent export country, especially to the United States. You hit Canadian exports and say we retaliate, this is a big economic hit to our country right now. Yeah. It would probably cause us maybe not get into recession, but at least flirt with it. Yeah. And I think that's really the worry, but so far we haven't had that yet. But if that does happen, yeah, absolutely, we're getting into the 60-cent handle for Canadian. And I guess
the Bank of Canada is still having to react to that happens too. So
yeah, I think it would also mean lower economic growth in Canada, right? Yeah. So you're gonna have the lower loonie, but you're also going to have lower economic growth. So the Bank of Canada is going to be in a tough place in that situation because they don't want to see the loonie keep going down, but they need to make sure they protect economic growth.